Well, so good to have all of you with us today. I'm super excited about this series we're kicking off called Mosaic, Fractured, Not Forgotten. And as you walked into one of our physical campuses, you should have received one of these small glass tiles. If you didn't get one, just slip your hand up in the air and we'll have someone give you one. If you're connecting digitally right now, just know I'll explain more to you specifically here in a moment, so you're not going to miss out at all. Also, I just want to highlight, if you want to watch the message or the entire service, you can always just go to tcconline.tv, click on demand. We have discussion guides there and so much more. Now, think with me. As a child, there was an innocence to faith, wasn't there? As a child, there was a view of God that just seemed a bit simpler. If you have kids right now, you just know there's just something pure, there's something innocent, there's something simple to a child's faith. But here's what happens. As we get older, as we will experience more of life just personally in our life, but also as we see what's going around in our world, faith just becomes so complicated and so multifaceted, doesn't it? And you think about the prayer life of a child, so innocent compared to, well, I know what my prayer life sounds like now. You see, I think about, some of these prayers from kids. This one is, Dear God, did you mean for a giraffe to look like that, or was it an accident? And there's probably a whole list of animals we can add to that. The aardvark, was that an accident? Or a groundhog, is that an accident? A platypus? I mean, I'm not highlighting any specific animals. I'm just saying, there's a list of animals. Hey, God, was that an accident? And then you think about this prayer, Dear God, are you a ninja? Is that why I can't see you? Jacob. Now, Jacob could have picked a ghost, but ghosts are scary, but he picked something cool, a ninja. Then there's this prayer, Dear God, if you let the dinosaur not become extinct, we would not have a country. You did the right thing, Jonathan. I just love the last line. You did the right thing. He must have watched Jurassic Park, but I started thinking about that. It's it'd be really, really scary if you walked out your front door and T-Rexes and velociraptors were running wild across the PA wild. And then there's this prayer. Dear God, thank you for the baby brother. But what I prayed for was a puppy. If you would sit down right now and write, Dear God, what would come after that? You see, for all of us, I think the complicated side of our faith journey is when we sit down to write a Dear God prayer, and as we get really honest and really transparent, especially when life is getting more and more complicated and more difficult, those prayers start to sound something like this. Dear God, where are you right now? Have you thought that? When you look around you and you just go like, God, I don't see you. I don't see you involved. I don't see you working. God, hey, where are you? And that question leads to this, Dear God, why are you allowing this? I mean, as you looked at the news, read the news, watched the news, have you thought that? And have you processed through your life? Have you thought that? It's like, hey, God, why are you allowing that? And then that question leads to this one. Well, what are you going to do? What say you, God? Are you just going to allow all of this to crumble around our world and in my life? God, what say you? Come on, God. And this thought process that starts to creep, and I know it creeps into my mind, and maybe it's crept into your mind. It's this question. Does God see what I see? Have you thought that before? Does God feel what I feel? Does God even notice what I'm noticing? And I think that's what gets so difficult in the faith journey. And that's why sometimes you just want to go back to a small child and say, hey, God, I got a deep question. What about the giraffe's neck? Hey, God, are you a ninja? Sometimes we just want to go back that. But our prayers, I know my prayers get so complicated because I just want to say, hey, God, do you see what I see? Well, in this series, we're going to be looking at a story. It's a powerful story. And I think just maybe, especially if these are some of the questions you or asking yourself right now that you're thinking right now that maybe this series can help, well, be an encouragement to you. But before we jump into the specific story we're going to be looking at throughout the series Mosaic, I want to give some context of what was going on in the world during this moment, during this story. You see, the Persian Empire was the world powerhouse during this time period. And the Bible actually highlights 4 of the main Persian kings that, that led the Persian Empire. The founder of the Persian Empire, the first main king, was Cyrus the Great. He conquered Babylon in 539. He liberated the Jews, and he made a decree for the Jews to start to rebuild the temple. Remember, Babylon took the remaining Jews, the southern kingdom, and took them off into exile. For 70 years, they were exiled into Babylon. And so when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, he said, hey, you can go home. Now, not all of them did go home, but they now had the option. And not only that, he encouraged them, say, hey, here's my official decree. Start building your temple because I know how important it is for you. The next king that the Bible kind of highlights of the Persian Empire is Darius. And you might know Darius from the famous Battle of Marathon. Is actually where we get, kind of our modern day marathon, even though we're not really sure all the details line up perfectly. But it is that famous Battle of Marathon. Darius was the king during the kids' famous story, Daniel and the Lion's Den. And during Darius's reign, the temple was completed. And then after Darius, we had Xerxes, but we're going to come back to Xerxes, and we're going to highlight his son, Artaxerxes. You see, Artaxerxes, if you're familiar with the story of Nehemiah, Nehemiah was a cupbearer for Artaxerxes. Nehemiah helped rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, in which Artaxerxes helped him do. And, during Artaxerxes' reigns, Ezra the scribe and priest restored the Torah, God's law, God's command, back into Jerusalem. But this story is anchored to, Xerxes. And you all know Xerxes. He was the famous leader of the Battle of Thermopylae. And, that story, if you've ever watched Frank Miller's 300, it was when just a small number of Spartan soldiers went up against the all-powerful Persian Empire. They didn't win, but they came close. It was actually a game changer for this emerging Greek empire that actually thought that maybe one day they could overthrow Persia, in which Alexander the Great did. It was Xerxes that marched on Athens and completely destroyed Athens. And in the Bible, he's not called Xerxes, he's called Ahasuerus. If I said that properly, who knows? But that's the name that the Bible uses for him. And you see, it was King Xerxes that was the world power, the most powerful person in the known world during this time period of the story. The story called Esther. Now, what's interesting about the story now called Esther is some scholars believe it's a historical story, but some scholars they equate it more to a parable. And a parable was something that Jesus used a lot. He told a fictitious story with a guiding truth, a guiding principle. It's something that Jesus used a lot. And some scholars think that this maybe is more fiction than historical, but they still say the parable, the guiding truth is still there. And so whichever way maybe you want to lens it, it doesn't take away from the guiding principle, the guiding truth. And that's the thing we want to hold on to tightly, is there is a powerful truth being taught within this story. You see, what's fascinating about the story of Esther is that that God is never mentioned in this entire story, in this entire book. Actually, there's 2 books in the Bible where God is never mentioned. Esther is one of them, and I'm not going to give you the second one. You just need to go find it. Another interesting insight to the story of Esther is religious imagery and language are completely missing. And, by the way, the story of Esther is filled with sex and drinking and murder and plot twists. And right now, I got some of your attention. You're like, what? That's in the Bible? It's all in the Bible. And you might be wondering, well, so why do we read this story? Why do we pay attention to the story if God's never mentioned it? If the religious teaching undertones are missing? And why would we read the story if it's about sex and murder and plot twists and drinking? Like, why would we? Because here's a powerful truth. You see God move in unseen ways. You see God move, active in the unseen. And you see God works sometimes where you can see him work. And sometimes he works in ways where you can't see him. Sometimes we read about God in very visible ways. And other times God is moving in the invisible. And this is a story of God doing something so supernatural behind the scenes. You see, it's a story of God who is engaged even when he seems disengaged. It's a story of God who is moving and even when he seems stagnant. It's a story of God who is present even when he seems absent. But the story starts with King Xerxes, the most powerful man in the known world. And so as we step into the story, we're told that, well, King Xerxes held a feast in the third year of his reign. Now, you got to understand that this isn't like a feast jumping in your car on Thanksgiving, driving to grandma's house. We're going to eat turkey and sweet potato pie and her famous apple pie. It's not that type of feast. This type of feast was like if you jumped on a plane, went to Vegas with all your college friends for a weekend bender. That's the type of feast that we're talking about here. It was the third year of his reign, meaning he had really established his authority and his power now as king. And we're told that for a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth. Now, the Persian Empire had collected a lot of wealth. You see, under Cyrus the Great, when he conquered Babylon, he got all of that wealth. After Cyrus the Great, it was actually his son that reigned for a short period of time, Shambus, and he went and conquered Egypt, so they got all of that wealth. Darius conquered some of India, modern-day India, and got all of that wealth. And so by the time Xerxes became king, he had inherited all of that wealth from all of those nations. And so vast wealth is an understatement of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. And after that 180 days, we're told that he gave a banquet lasting 7 days enclosed in the garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. And by the king's command, King Xerxes' command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions. Like I said, I mean, this was like a weekend bender in Vegas. No restrictions. For the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. And on the seventh day of this feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits. Why? He's been drinking for 7 days. 7 days. All of a sudden, he sends his staff to bring him Queen Vashti. Now, what we know in the text is he ordered her to come and to walk in front of all of the guests. Now, at this point, this feast, it was just the men gathering all together, drinking for 7 days. We also know that Queen Vashti was having her own banquet for the women. So the women were gathered together, the men were just drinking for 7 days. And so we know that he wanted her to walk in front of all of the men within the palace, within the court. Some scholars actually believe, because the text says that he ordered her to wear this ornate crown or ornate turban. And some scholars think that he only wanted her to wear that, nothing else. Some scholars say that's kind of reading into it. Either way, he wanted to put her on display. And what did Queen Vashti say? She said, no, I'm not going to come. I'm not going to do it. But here's the thing we all know. You don't tell a king no, especially the most powerful king in the known world at that time. You just never say no to the king. And how do you think that made the king feel? Well, we're told that the king became furious and he burned with anger. And so he looked at the people around him and he says, hey, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? She can't tell me no. She can't not come when I summons her. She must do what I say. And I can't believe that she said no. And he asks, she has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes. He's now talking about himself, right, in the third person, that the eunuchs have taken to her. She told me no. So he summons his advisors so that they can give him advice. They nominate a spokesperson, and the spokesperson, shares with the king what they think he should do. He says, Queen Vashti has done wrong, but not only against the king, but against all. Catch this, all the nobles. I mean, yes, the king done wrong against you, Xerxes, but you have to realize all your leaders, all the power brokers, all the people with great wealth, all the people watching over all of your land, this affects them as well. You got to realize, Xerxes, it's not just you. It's all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. They go on and they say, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husband. And this is what they might say, King Xerxes, to tell you what's coming. King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. And this very day, the Persian and Median woman of the nobility will have heard about the queen's conduct and will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. And there will be no end of the disrespect and discord. I mean, could you feel that? So, simply, what did the wise advisors of King Xerxes say to the king? This is what they said. Xerxes, you have to put all the women back in their place. Now, I'm not saying this. I don't agree with this. Right? Don't get mad at me. I'm just giving a summary of what they said to them. Like, hey, king, you got to put her back in place. I mean, all these nobles, man, if their wives start telling them no, now the nobles are going to be mad at you because you didn't put an end to it. You got to put them all back into place. So they came up with a solution for King Xerxes. And they said, therefore, if it pleases a king, let him issue a royal decree. Now, this is really important. So don't miss this, because this is going to come into play as we make our way through this entire story. He said, hey, let them issue a royal decree and let them be written in the laws of the Persian and Media, which cannot be repealed. Now, this is important. In the Persian Empire, once the Persian king made a decree, he himself couldn't change it. It was law. He couldn't change it. So they're setting this up. And then they said, hey, king, there's two components of this decree that you need to make sure that you put into law. That Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she is. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands. Now, we got to pause there. Husbands, lean in. Boyfriends, lean in. Fiancés, lean in. This is horrible dating, relationship, marriage advice. If you have to demand respect, your relationship is done. If you have to demand honor, your relationship is done. If you have to demand loyalty, your relationship is done. In fact, this is just Leadership 101 advice, any type of relationship advice. If you have to demand respect, it's over. I worked for someone that demanded honor but never gave honor. I worked for someone that demanded loyalty but never gave loyalty. I worked for someone that demanded respect and never gave respect. People around the table acted like it, but no one did. No one did. You see, we have to understand that even at this level, the king could decree something. Doesn't mean it changes anything. Maybe on the surface, but it won't impact anyone personally. And his advisors are just say, ban Vashti, find someone better. That's the decree. Ban the queen, find someone better. And then we're told in the story that later. Now we know this is several years later because the third year of the reign is where we stepped into the story. And now as we move into this next part of the story, it's the 7th year. So we know this is somewhere 2 to 3 years after that. And we're told that, well, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, now here's another really important insight. None of us make wise decisions when we're angry, do we? None of us say wise things when we're angry, do we? None of us make those decisions that later we look back on like, oh, that was such a great decision when we're angry. Right? A lot of regret comes when we talk, when we act, when we decide out of anger, don't we? It's true. As a parent, it's true. As a leader, it's true. As a friend, it's true. That's why I always encourage people, take 24 hours. Take a deep breath. Go to bed. Wake up the next morning. Anger will subside and you'll start thinking clearer. You will make better, wiser decisions when all of that, well, red line emotion has dissipated. And all of a sudden, several years later, guess what? All of that fury had, well, dissipated for him. And he started to think through what he had done to Vashti. And his attendants come to him and says, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. And then let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This process started in motion because guess what? A king needs a queen. And this enters, well, 2 of the main characters of the story, Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai's name the root of his name gets tethered to the Babylonian god Marduk, and Esther's name gets tethered into, well, this ancient Babylonian word, Ishtar, that gets connected to one of their star goddesses, which became the Roman goddess Venus. Both of them were Jews, but they were part of the exile in Babylon. And so when Persia came in, they're now part of that empire. And we know that, well, Mordecai and Esther are cousins. In fact, Esther's parents died. We don't know how, but they died. And so the king starts to search for the next queen. And so, well, beautiful young virgins from across the Persian Empire were brought into the king. There was a process that was put into place. And Esther was one of them that was, well, not asked, because kings don't ask, do they? Commanded, taken, forced. And she, well, entered into this process. And we're told that she pleased him. And who's him, you might be wondering. Well, him was a guy named Haggai. And Haggai was, well, he was in charge of the king's harem. And Esther won Haggai's favor, and immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. But not just that, it gets better. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. And when the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested it. Now, this gets into the process. The process is going to be unthinkable, especially in our day and age, but this is what happened. Some scholars think there was somewhere around 400 young, beautiful virgins. Some have that number much higher, but they were all brought in. And then as they went through their beauty treatments, one by one, they were brought to the king to spend the night with the king. The next day, they were released from the king, and they waited. And if the king would summon her, then she would become queen. But after spending the night with the king, if he never summoned her, that young girl would forever, the rest of her life, live as a widow, waiting just maybe that the king might summon her, which he never would. Think about that. And Esther, this young girl, is now walking in to the king's chamber. And we're told that Esther won favor of everyone who saw her. But not just everyone who saw her. We're told that the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women. And she won his favor and approval more than, any of the other virgins. So guess what the king did? He set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then he gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. But what we have to understand is this isn't some fairy tale pauper to princess to queen story for Esther. It's not. This is not some Cinderella with a slipper that fit her foot right to become queen story. Think about this. Esther, a Jewish girl who was exiled, living in a foreign land, not even her homeland, where the customs and cultures and faith was completely different. She had a pagan name. I mean, her Jewish name was Odessa, but people called her Esther. Her parents died, and she was forced. She didn't get selected. It wasn't like some beauty contest where she was so honored that they chose her. No. She got forced. She got taken, forced into the process. Had to go spend the night with the king and then just wait. Think about that. And now she's queen. And she knew the story about Queen Vashti. She knew what the king did to Vashti. She knew what everyone else did to Vashti. I mean, she knew the story. I mean, you just had to pause and realize, again, this isn't some fairy tale pauper to queen story. For Esther, she had to be thinking to herself, God, where are you? Hey, God, do you see me? Hey, God, do you even care? Hey, God, what are you going to do about my life? Hey, God, show me something. I don't know what your life looks like. I don't know if your name was on this list, what it would look like. But what you need to hold on to is when life is unfair, when life is cruel, when life is pain-riddled and stacked against you. You got to hold on that God is with you. You see, what I find so amazing about this story is God is never mentioned in the entire story of Esther, but we're going to see God work behind the scenes. We're going to see God move behind the scenes. We're going to see God work in ways that, again, be so easy to miss. But yet God is so intentional. Right now, if you would sit down and write a dear God, what questions would you ask him? What pain will anchor to your journey right now? What's the unknowns that it's just deafening in your thought process? Would you say to God, do you see what I see? Right now, if you're at one of our physical campuses, churches, your campus pastor is going to come up and will lead you on to a pretty cool next step. For all of those of you joining online digitally with us, I mentioned at the beginning that, at our physical campuses, people received one of these little glass tiles, and obviously we can't shove one through the screen at you right now, but we want to do something for you. You see, there's going to be a song that's played here in just a few moments, and the words are so powerful because we have the vantage point of looking back, story after story after story, the Bible. Difficult moments that people faced, uncertainty that people faced, the why God that people faced, the God, where are you that people face. And we get to look back and see God show up and show off in such incredible ways. You see, we just have to remember, we just have to trust that even if we don't see God working, even if we don't see God moving, we can trust that he is. And one day, we're going to peer back and we're going to see God's fingerprints all over the place. One day, we're going to look back and say, God, I see what you did. I didn't in the moment. I didn't recognize it when I was going through it. Maybe I didn't even like it at that time, but God, now as I look back, I see your perfect plan. I see you working and orchestrating and guiding in such a powerful way. So in this moment, as we step into this song, I want you to listen to the words. I think they're going to be a huge encouragement to you. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do. If you're just having a dear God moment, I'm not sure what the next phrase or the next sentence or the next paragraph or the next chapter would be written after dear God. But what you see, and you're just trying to see God in the midst of your pain. You're trying to see God in the midst of your loss. You're trying to see God in the midst of the uncertainty. You're trying to see God in the midst of what you are facing. If you're in one of those seasons right now, all I ask you to do is in the chat, just type your initials. And someone from our team will take one of these glass tiles and they're just going to write your initials on one of them. We'll do that for you. But as you type those initials in that chat box, simply say a prayer. Say, hey, God, I trust you. Even if I don't see you, even if I don't understand how you're leading, how you're working, God, even if I can't grasp why you're allowing me or a loved one to go through what they're going through. But God, I'm going to choose to trust in the unseen. Type your initials in. Hit send. And know that we'll put your initials on a tile for you. You see, there's something powerful. Even when we don't see God, to trust that God is doing the unseen. Let me pray for you. Lord, right now, I just pray. Maybe just in this moment where people are connecting from right now, they'll just sense your presence. They'll just sense your presence. Lord, I pray that they'll know that even when it feels like life is just stacked up against them, that you are with them and that you, Heavenly Father, are for them. that you see what they see. And you know what they feel. And maybe your answer to our prayers isn't what we're asking. But Lord, I just pray that we will trust you, knowing that you care for us and that you're guiding us. In your name I pray.